Hi everyone, welcome to your guide on feminism and art. The next couple weeks we are going to be taking a look first at Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, but we're also going to be talking a bit about gender roles and how gender roles have been portrayed so far in the course, but also we'll be taking a little bit of a leap to modern times and talking about if these sorts of issues actually have percolated to the 21st century. We'll be making this pretty relevant, but one of the things I wanted to spend some time doing is actually looking at art, looking at some artwork and talking about women in art and how they've been portrayed, and also how men have been portrayed. There's a little bit of a brain warm-up and something to kind of get you thinking a little bit. So bear with me here. You want to have a notebook out. I'm going to have you guys jot down a couple things as we go through this presentation. So the first thing I want to take a look at is this image. Before I go in and explain what this image is, hit the pause button on your computer of this video and take a minute or so and try to write down free form what you think is happening in this picture. Describe it. Go ahead and hit pause and then come on back in a second. Alright, now that you've returned, this is a very busy picture that you're taking a look at. The title of it is The Accommodations of the Royal Academy, and it was painted by Johann Zoffany between the years of 1771 and 1772. It may be a little bit confusing for you to take a look at this and realize what's going on, but what you actually have here is a nude figure drawing class. And it's kind of evident. If you take a look on the right-hand side, there are two naked men who are there, and they are posing, obviously, and the men in the room are observing. Some of them are sketching. You can see the one on the lower left-hand side actually has a painter's palette. And if you know art, and you are involved with art, one of the things that is a pretty common knowledge is that in order for you to really paint and draw the human form, the human body, you have to study it anatomically. You really have to study the nude form. It's a very sort of common practice, even in low-level art classes, to have a figure drawing class where students study a nude model and draw and paint them accordingly. What's really interesting about this portrait, and it's kind of stems at our conversation, is if you look at the group of men who are there, they're all men. There are no women anywhere in this picture, except one very odd place. If you take a look at the upper right-hand corner of this image, there are two portraits there, and they are women, both of the portraits that are hanging on the wall. Believe it or not, the Royal Academy, what this is, was a particularly famous art school in London, and the two women who are in the portraits on the upper right-hand corner were actually two of the original founders of the Royal Academy. So why are women not in this class? Well, it was considered majorly taboo for women to partake in nude drawing classes. It really wasn't until the extremely late 19th century, early 20th century, that women were allowed in these academies to actually sit in on nude drawing courses. So if we can all agree of the common conception that one really needs to know how to, for one to paint or for one to draw the human body, one needs to look at it nude, you already are starting to see the disadvantage that women had in the art world. I think with our modern perceptions, we think of art as being something feminine, which it absolutely has not been. Actually, women have been considered sort of second-class citizens in the art world from the very beginning, and it really has not been until very recently that art historians have gone back and really taken a feminist approach to looking at artwork. If you think what I'm saying is absurd, I can assure you that it's not. Even as late as the 60s, a reviewer of art, I believe he wrote for the New York Times, went to see a gallery opening of a female artist, and he didn't realize it was a female artist at first. once he arrived to the gallery and realized that it was a female artist, he started his column, his review of the gallery, as saying, we were very excited about this artwork, but when we realized it was a woman artist, we checked our enthusiasm at the door. So this is definitely something pretty tangible. This is definitely something pretty real so far as the way men and women have been portrayed in the art world. And we're going to take a look at a couple more images now that kind of make that concrete. This next image you may have actually seen if you've ever been to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, something that I highly encourage everyone to do if you are a local. It's called the Gross Clinic. Thomas Eakins from 1875. If you take a look at this image, what you're seeing is actually a doctor with his students performing some sort of operation or autopsy on a sort of unidentifiable patient laying there. And as you take a look into the audience of the lecture hall, you're seeing particularly all men. There are all men being portrayed here. There's one female figure, and it's kind of like, where's Waldo? Where is she? If you look at the bottom left-hand corner of this image, you see a figure covering her face. So it's a very interesting image for a couple reasons. One, the role of the female has literally been reduced to not having anything to do with what the men are actually performing here. And not only has the woman been reduced to not being involved, she's literally being portrayed as sort of this cowering subject in the corner. We don't even see her face. She's covering it. She doesn't even want to look at the incisions, the blood that's taking place. Yet the rest of the figures are all men in the picture. Very interesting how in this image the men have the power, right? And how the female is greatly reduced. I want you to keep this in mind as we go forward a couple images later. Around the same time period, though, there were several female artists, and they were trying to make a difference. They really were looking at the way that women were portrayed in art. This is another image that you may have seen if you've been to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's by Mary Cassatt, who was really one of the foremost artists in the 19th century to really re-examine how men and women were portrayed in artwork. This particular image is called Woman and Child Driving. And what we see here, obviously, is a female figure who is at the helm of a horse and buggy. She is the one who is in power here with a young girl seated next to her. Now, we might be able to make the assumption that they are mother and daughter. But I think what's really interesting here, via Cassatt, is that Cassatt doesn't name the portrait mother and daughter driving. She calls it woman and child. So I think there's a very clear reason why she titled it such, trying to sort of break those expectations of what a mother-daughter would look like in an image. Something else I want to bring to your attention, really interesting. There's one other figure in this picture. It is of a male. And in this instance, he's the one who's in the back riding in the carriage. We can barely see his face. So really interesting, polar different dynamics in this image versus that first image we took a look at. The female figures here are forefront. They're in command. They are the ones who are in charge. While we have a male figure who essentially turned his back and is literally riding in the carriage. Real role reversal here. And quite an interesting image. So let's go back to Eakins. Let's look at another image of his from several years later, from 1889, okay, the Anjou Clinic. Once again, if you've been to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, you may have seen this. It's also owned by the University of Pennsylvania, so if you've been there, you may have seen it as well. Same sort of scenario that we saw in the first Eakins. We obviously have a doctor running some sort of medical clinic for medical students. If we look in the audience, we once again very typically have all men. In this image, though, very interestingly enough, we have two females. Okay, one we can see on the lower right-hand side, dressed very sort of traditionally as a nurse. Very sort of clear expectations. Where would a woman be in a clinical medical setting? Well, a nurse. And there she is. At least she's not covering her face this time like the first clinic picture that we took a look at, what I find even more interesting is look at who is being operated on. It's very clearly a woman, and we can tell by the exposed breast laying there on the table. So what many critics have actually written about this piece is when we look at both clinic pictures kind of side to side and we take into account the time period where you have people like Cassatt trying to re-image the way women are portrayed in artwork, this picture by Eakins literally once again puts the woman in a submissive role, not only as the nurse, kind of as the assistant, but literally as being the one who's being chopped open on the table. Really interesting here when you compare it to the original Eakins image and to the Cassatt we just took a look at. But this whole sort of portrayal of female figures versus male figures in artwork, it still goes on through the day. This is actually a very modern image from 1981 by an artist named Barbara Kruger. You may be familiar with her work. You may have seen it. What Kruger does is she takes a black and white image, many times photography, and she imposes words on it. This particular image was untitled, and as you take a look, it has words running on the left-hand side. It says, "Your gaze hits the side of my face." There's a little bit of a play of words going on here, and there's actually something here that you should be familiar with given the content of the course. Let's talk about the play on words. What you're seeing here is obviously a bust, a sculpture of a female head, right? One of the things that you hear about in art history and art criticism is the whole concept of what they call the feminine gaze. What does that mean? Many times traditional male artists would paint women, many times nude, and the whole object of the painting was for men, heterosexual men, to look at the image and have that feminine gaze, look at the beauty of the nude female or the clothed female in the portrait. What Kruger does here is she takes this cold statue, this thing that's cold and clinical, and essentially rubs that whole idea of the feminine gaze and turns it upside down. Essentially says that gaze is going to hit the side of my face. I'm not paying any attention to it. Alright, this cold statue, we see it sort of in a profile format. But what's even more interesting to tie into what we've done is this particular sculpture is of somebody that we have studied in this course. It is a sculpture of Helen of Troy. So this adds a really interesting dynamic. If you remember back to Agamemnon when we talked a little bit about the backstory, we talked about how Helen of Troy many times was nicknamed as the gaze that hit the face that launched 1,000 ships. Her beauty was so overwhelming that men just swooned to her, and literally, you know, she caused the Trojan War. That adds a whole nother element to this image, one that I would encourage you to think about as we go forward in this unit. So, just some food for thought here. Really interesting stuff, and I encourage you to analyze things at a little bit of a deeper level. You may have seen these images before this and kind of looked at them and not really thought about it in the context that we're reviewing them at. But I think one of the biggest points of this course is to have you guys, as college-level learners, as human beings, appreciate the humanities and really look at art and writing in the way that maybe you haven't thought so before. So, with that said, go ahead and move on now and take a little bit of a look at Vindication of the Rights of Women, which we'll be talking about this week. And we'll play a little bit over the next couple weeks, like I said at the beginning, about gender roles and how they apply today.